Nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Brethren in Christ, Laudetur Jesus Christus.
In secula.
This is Timothy Flanders with the meaning of Catholic. Jesus is King. Welcome to the Terror of Demons morning show. It is farmers' hours on the eastern seaboard of the Americas. Welcome to all our viewers from Italy, Australia, Aussies in the house, India,
Honduras,
early and up. Let's see. Oh, we got Anthony in the house. Welcome, New York City. So today's topic: why Vatican II failed. 4 reasons. This will be my historical hypothesis, which will also include a magisterial defense of Kennedy's Libertarian. So that'll
Benvenute gli italiani, bienvenidos a los hispanos, something in Indian I don't know, and g'day mate, Theology, and Anthony Abate. Are you Sicilian or are you Italian? Because they're not the same thing. I don't know.
You have to do it in a New York accent then. Say good night.
Yeah. I don't know how to do that. I'll sound like a LARPer or something if I try that.
A French Canadian Italian who speaks Spanish trying to do New York accent. We'll have to get you to do that sometime. So we've got the second week after Epiphany. We had the third mystery of Epiphany, which is the changing the water into wine. One of my favorite gospel passages.
It's amazing.
Jesus comes to the party. And what does he do? He tells them all to stop drinking because Christians don't drink, right? Some say. The enthusiasts only say that, though, right, Jeremiah?
That's correct, yes.
The enthusiasts don't like alcohol. So Jesus turns water into wine. That is how he reveals his glory, is by bringing the new wine to the party. So, yes.
Well, there's an old Baptist joke, eh? You have to be careful of the conjugal act because it might lead to dancing.
Might lead to dancing. Oh, boy. So, yes, Jesus turns water to wine. Today is St. Anthony, the great father of monasticism. And later on, we have Saints Fabian and Sebastian. Later this week, St. Agnes and St. Vincent of Anastasia, some early martyrs. So, wonderful Epiphany tide. Hope you're all enjoying a very happy Epiphany tide. It's a wonderful time of year. Newsflash, Lent is coming. Septuagesima, February 13.
Yeah.
Now's a great time to take stock of your spiritual life and make some plans. Jeremiah, how's the book going?
It's going awesome. I'm down to the final week and completed the chapter about where I don't say any words. So that was actually kind of a creative difficulty, like trying to write a chapter where normally, you don't want it to sound like an info dump, and so you want to try to use action words and things like that, but you're also contemplative because I was in silence and solitude. I was cleaning the house, and it was really an important time because I was touching all of those items from the past and reflecting. Seeing pictures of myself with my daughter back when we would read the Bible and have a rosary. It's when I rediscovered my beautiful image of Our Lady that I have behind me here now, and read blogs and articles that I'd written against atheism that I'd kind of hidden for a long time. And so it was very deep. And at the end of that, there's a really powerful thing that happens at the end, and it kind of leads to the next phase, which is gradually getting to the place where we go back to church. So I'm kind of skipping around in the final chapters, but I'm excited about it. And I may even start sending the earlier chapters that are already done. I may even just start sending them already, just start kind of just giving you bits and pieces as I go, stuff that's already done. So I'm really excited, but please pray for me. So the goal is to have it done on the feast day of St. Francis, and super pumped about that. Novena is going on right now. So seriously, pray for me. I really need it because it's emotional and stuff, but I'm pushing through. So I'm excited about that. And I'm excited to finally have a book, man. I've been writing for so long. I've been writing for not just this book, but writing other things like my article that got published over at 1 Peter 5 recently. And so I'm happy about that. That's actually resulted in pretty wild conversations with sedevacantists who just don't get it. they don't even know how to deal with this.
What are they, enthusiasts or something? I just don't understand why they wouldn't get it.
Dude, well,
What's the problem?
because they're stuck on the idea of debating a thesis and not the underlying assumptions that, and it's funny, the best example is this Sede guy. He says some pretty dumb stuff. Like he said, well, you called us Protestant. And I said, no, I didn't. He said, well, you said we had Martin Lutheritis. And I said, well, that's like saying you have Lou Gehrig's disease means that you're a New York Hall of Fame baseball player. Like, that doesn't make any sense. I said, you have the same disease. You have the same symptoms that come from the same disease. So it just happens to be a very popular guy who everybody knows had it. So yeah, Martin Lutheritis works. It's actually a really scientific term anyway. So the, like, but the thing is, he says, somebody said that St. Francis de Sales never used this argument, this idea of going back to first things, right? Your most ruling and basic assumptions. And I said, not only did he do that, it's basically the only argument he uses the entire time. Like, so the canon, by what authority? Holy orders, by what authority? Your interpretation versus this one, let me think here. Hold on. By what authority? It just goes back and back and back every single time. And he keeps throwing it back in this place because he knows that they can't answer that. He knows that their system has a major deficit. And that without that deficit, you have chaos of interpretation, chaos of church order. There's none. Anybody has holy orders, like, so he knew it and he pounded away at it. And I told him, I said, and Catholics use it every time that they debate Protestants and they talk about the canon of scripture. When they talk about holy orders, when they talk about whatever with Protestants, it always comes back to this, because otherwise we're in the same battle that Protestants are with each other, saying, well, let's throw this verse on the table and do our best lights and our monocle thing that we're going to look at it and try to figure it out. Well, at the end of the day, we don't even accept the Gospels were it not for the church. Okay. The church is the one who gave the authority to even do that. So the idea that we're going to say, well, I don't accept the Gospels if it weren't for the church, but I'm going to go ahead and I need to do this all on my own. Like, just nonsense. So they don't even.
That's but part 3 of your article, right?
That's part 2.
Well, part 2, but you're going to go more into it in part 3.
Well, part 3, all part 3 is going to be is just simply breaking it down and saying, here's an example of where he uses it. Here's another example each time, just saying, here's what he does, driving it back. And he begins by saying it's what he's going to do, that he's going to keep this kind of very general principle, right? And he's going to draw stuff back to it. He warns them ahead of time and he does it. And we're going to address, of course, where he talks about a heretical pope and what that is. And so we're going to talk about that. It's going to be a lot of fun, but it's been a good time.
Yeah, stay tuned. So part 3 is coming soon. But speaking of books, tomorrow, everyone needs to go buy the reprint of Terror of Demons. That's right. The new and improved tan reprint. Kennedy, tell us about, I got to go grab a book. Kennedy, tell us about the reprint.
Well, it is the same book, except it's been redone with a new cover. It's been, how many months? I took it off in June of 2021. My goodness gracious, these 2 weeks of Slow to Spread have just flown by. The book came out in May 1st, 2020. And, I'll be honest, this book has been, like anything from God, a blessing has brought many crosses to it. I can't believe how many people bought the thing, and it actually enabled me to sort of change my financial direction, which is I'm very lucky as far as books are concerned. And so Tan caught wind of it and said, let's try this. And I thought, okay, the thing about self-publishing is that it is a really good way to do things. But you sort of exhaust your own marketing. I mean, I'm not like Taylor Marshall or something where, you can, or like Steve Bannon or something where you can just do a show and make sure you get 100,000 views and so I thought, okay, we'll go with Tan and we'll see what happens. And they've been really great so far. And that cover, the thing about this that I can't believe is the cover that they made. Like, somebody actually did an original painting and everything like that. And it's amazing. I couldn't have thought of a better. And I have actually, because Amazon does not ship author copies to Canada because of, I don't know, science or something. So, but Tan obviously does because, they're like, their own publisher. So I got a shipment of like 35 or 50 books or something. And I actually was able to hold one in my hand, and they're all hardcover. And it's an impressive thing. Like, you could put this thing on your coffee table and people will pick this up and be like, what's this? This looks pretty intense. And they've done a wonderful job. And so that's coming out tomorrow. And there's also a Kindle version. And so there you go. That's it.
Yes,
I read a review that I saw some negative reviews that it seems like a lot of toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
That toxic masculinity.
Yeah, and it was always from people that was like, it didn't have the verified purchase, and they're like on there and like, this is garbage. This is toxic masculinity, and I'm like, it's on the cover. Like, it's literally.
So what's funny about that is when it came out, long story long, but my wife had quite a big Instagram account. She used to be I guess she is still a makeup artist, but she sort of hung up the brushes, because she's not really working anymore. But she was quite talented. Like, she could make you look like a 3-dimensional face change, look like an animal. She was, and also do weddings and things. She was pretty amazing. So she had this pretty big Instagram account that she would do the faces of the ladies she had done. So she had a big following, most of whom were just sort of popular culture females. And my wife wears her heart on her sleeve like her husband does. And as she had a conversion, she started talking more traditional and ladylike and all that sort of stuff and old school on her Instagram. When I put out the book, she had this inclination. I'm just going to share this to my thousands and thousands, like 10,000 plus followers or something. And the feminists lost their mind. And it got to the point where we almost had to let go of the police because of some of the things. And they would make these accounts. I contacted Amazon, and some of the reviews are like, even though I've never read this, I know it's awful. It's just full of the worst stuff ever. I can just tell it makes me sick and all this kind of stuff. And that was the first 20 reviews and down day one. And we were kind of like, well, this is interesting. But then even with that, it still had 4.5 stars overall, because everyone who read it is like a 5-star.
And how does, maybe you don't know the answer to this, I don't know, but I wonder how downvotes and stuff work on that, because I know that for example, like YouTube, they've taken the downvotes off, which I think is actually rather unfortunate. But at the same time, downvotes on YouTube and even on other social media platforms where it's got different reactions and stuff, even if it's not happy about it, that actually plays to your benefit because it's still an engagement. And I wonder if that's true with Amazon, or if that's a totally different ball game where it's if it's garbage, people are like, it doesn't look.
I don't know, but a lot of people said they bought it because of the negative reviews.
Yeah, it plays in your favor.
It'd be like a Clinton supporter being like, this is just deplorable MAGA nonsense. And you're like, well, I want that.
You're like, yeah, I'll put that on the book. That's a blurb.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
No. And there he goes. He's out.
Oh,
He's done. Right. It's a professional. Yeah. I've wondered that though, about the review process and stuff, and I'll learn, I'm sure that even though the book that I'm writing I can imagine it being difficult to give too many negative reviews. I know it's common. I know that there'll be people who are angry, about the religious dynamic of it and everything else. And this guy used to be an atheist and now he's a Christian, so on and so on. And so, but I'll learn.
You get some Sades on your back, they'll be like, well, this guy can't be trusted.
Yeah, this guy can't be trusted. Yeah, the Sades are going to be downvoting the book,
So please, the link is below. Please buy Kennedy's book. Even if you already have a copy, buy a new copy. Put it on your coffee table to evangelize your guests who come over. Buy a new copy, give it to a priest, give it to a new father, give it to a new husband. It's a perfect gift for any man or woman. Give it to a woman, she'll give it to her man.
I've had a lot of that. I've had a lot of wives reading it because they're like, I don't know what to expect out of my husband, because no one knows anything anymore about any of this stuff, because who the heck is going to know? And so both they read it, and and that's worked for both.
Yeah, and this is critical. This is what we're all about, is restoring the Catholic men. When men of God arise, a lot of good things will happen, because the men, as we said before in the show, we have effeminate clergy, not because it's the clergy's fault. It's actually because of their fathers. It was their own fathers who didn't raise them to be men. So it's not really the clergy's fault. It goes further back than that. So once we have good masculine fathers, we have good men of God, we're going to have good families. So it's a very critical issue. So thank you, Kennedy, for writing this excellent book. Please buy it, buy many copies, distribute it to your parish. Have a reading group in your parish. Have a men's group in your parish. Read it for your Exodus group, men.
Can I give a defense of Exodus 90 for half a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the criticisms of Exodus 90, I've done it twice. Oh, 2.5 times, because we did a modified version for Advent, just shorter. We didn't do 90 days. We just did Advent. It's not a traditional Catholic program insofar as the readings and the calendar you get is traditional. And that's one of the criticisms I get from traditionalists. Will say, well, I'll just follow the liturgical calendar. It's like, well, that's great. But the point of Exodus 90 is that we've never fasted or mortified properly. So it's like it's a reset. You know, it's a training camp. So that's what it's good for. Yeah, obviously, if you've lived a life of traditional Catholic penance, then you just follow the liturgical calendar and you get like 100 days of fasting throughout the year anyway. That's fine. If you're Eastern, you're fasting 362 days a year. Traditionalists, don't knock the Exodus 90. I personally, when I did it, I didn't do the readings from the actual Exodus 90 program because they were a little bit too, they weren't enough for me. So I just read other stuff. But the disciplines were great. And it contains a lot of things in there that have nothing to do with tradition. They just have to do with what works as far as, psychological principles about how to discipline yourself better. Cold showers are not found in, I guess St. Francis Assisi and stuff, they talk about jumping in the snow and things for temptation. That's fine. But this idea of having cold showers is a very unique thing. And
you brought it up in your article on pornography, which, by the way, is awesome.
Yes. Thank you. So just don't knock it.
There's a lot of men that need to read that, by the way. We know, everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. Priests know it. Everybody knows it. And Kennedy wrote an excellent article, and I was really glad to see that 2 to 3 minute cold shower, because I've been doing that for like 2 years now. Originally because of Wim Hof, but then eventually,
Wim Hof.
I've been doing that for like 2 years, and then doing Exodus 90. I did good the first time, second time, not so good. I didn't do so good, but I tried doing it like online with people in Canada. But when you're with people local,
it's different.
And it's different.
Yeah, so definitely check it out. It's an excellent program. I don't know why anybody's complaining about some content. Get to fasting, men. You got to fast. If you don't fast, you're going to get destroyed by the world, the flesh, and the devil. That's just the basic fact, okay? You must fast. Fasting is essential. Okay, let's get into our topic. Why Vatican II failed. I'm going to assert that Vatican II is a failed council, and there needs to be a new magisterial direction to correct it. It is analogous to Lateran V, as we'll see in just a minute. Lateran V was the council in the spring of 1517, right before October 31st, 1517, which is where Martin Luther nailed his infamous theses, and the world exploded. So Lateran V was a complete failure, didn't do anything. We moved on from it, and then we had the Council of Trent. We had the Tridentine renewal after that. Nobody remembers Lateran V because it was a failure. So Vatican II is similar, but different, and that's what we'll talk about. So first of all, what I'm asserting is here's what I'm not asserting. I'm not asserting Vatican II as a magisterial failure, i.e. Vatican II magisterially taught error or heresy of any kind. Let the theologians figure that out. Every council does have some ambiguity. It's undisputable. Vatican II has ambiguity in the documents. That's fine. Every council has that. Nicaea was ambiguous about the divinity of the Holy Spirit. This is not a big problem if these things would have been followed, as I'll discuss in just a minute. So I'm not asserting Vatican II taught anything erroneous necessarily. And my camera keeps cutting out. I don't know. You'll have to let me know if I had. Did I just cut out?
Yeah, for a second
your audio is fine.
Yeah, did my audio continue?
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, my camera just keeps dying for a second. Anyways, well, if the audio is fine, then whatever. Okay. So we're gonna set aside the dispute about it's certainly debatable whether or not Vatican II actually teaches error. We'll just debate that later. What I'm saying is it is a historical failure. Now, I'm also not saying that Vatican II failed everywhere, but only in Western Europe and the Americas. it could certainly be argued that St. John Paul II's implementation of Vatican II in Poland helped to destroy Soviet Marxism on the Eastern Bloc. That I think that's very arguable. You could definitely say Vatican II was a success in Eastern Europe. You could also say it's a success among Eastern Catholics. The developments of Vatican II vis-a-vis Eastern Catholicism are very good. The condemnation of Latinizations, for example. You could also maybe argue Africa or Asia might be successes, perhaps. But the point is, what I'm saying is Western Europe and the Americas, the implementation Vatican II as a historical event was a failure because it did not bring about the intended renewal. And so I'm arguing here 4 reasons why that failure happened. Why was there no renewal in Western Europe and the Americas after Vatican II? Why was there the opposite? So the first reason is that the bishops disobeyed St. John the 23rd from Veterum Sapientiae. Veterum Sapientiae decreed in I think it was 1960, right before the council, that the Latin language must be maintained and defended against the revolutionaries who want to destroy Latin. At the time, Latin was not only the language of the documents, it was also the spoken language of the classroom in Rome. And if you don't know Latin, you really cannot do theology in the Latin church. I'll just put it that way. You cannot do theology in the Latin church without Latin. Have to have Latin. That's why John the 23rd decreed that it must be maintained and promoted as one of the most critical pieces, like foundations of our Western theology. But that goes straight into number 2. The second reason, which is the failure to implement the theological notes. Now, here they actually what was that?
That's a big deal. The theological notes. I'm glad you're bringing that up.
So here's the I'm going to read from Lumen Gentium. Lumen Gentium in the appendix actually gives everybody the explanation as to how are we to understand Vatican II in its authoritative character, in its binding character. What exactly is it? Which you can only understand if you know Latin. So here's what Lumen Gentium says at the very end. Oh, by the way, this is the Word on Fire Vatican II collection. If you want to learn the Steelman argument from the Communio side for Vatican II, this is the book to get. So this is on the page 130 of this. This is reading from the appendix of Lumen Gentium. So if you scroll down on the Vatican document, go all the way down to the appendix of the Lumen Gentium before the notes. This is what it says. This is from the decree of the Theological Commission, which was entered into the text of the document. Quote, taking conciliar custom into consideration and also the pastoral purpose of the present council. So already he's making reference to all sorts of things that are only in Latin, the scholastic tradition, the whole tradition of councils, the customs. So you're not even going to understand what this is unless you know all those things, first of all. The Sacred Council defines as binding on the church only those things in matter and faith and morals which it shall openly declare to be binding. Okay, so the council has to say, we bind the whole church to be held definitively XYZ. Now, it never said that in any of the documents, but it did say certain things where this Sacred Council teaches XYZ. For example, the condemnation of Latinizations. So that's certainly a teaching. But then it says the rest of the things which the Sacred Council sets forth, inasmuch as they are the teaching of the Church's supreme magisterium, ought to be accepted and embraced by each and every one of the Christ faithful according to the mind and Sacred Council. Now, here's the qualifier. According to the mind of the Sacred Council. Now, what does that mean? How are we supposed to know the mind of the Sacred Council? Well, it gives the answer. The mind of the council becomes known either from the matter treated or from its manner of speaking. Now, here's the key phrase. In accordance with the norms of theological interpretation. The norms of theological interpretation critically include the theological notes, which are scholastic distinctions which one can learn about if one reads and studies Latin. in particular. Now, not everything obviously is in Latin about the theological notes, but if you're not trained in Latin and you're trained in the scholastic tradition of these distinctions, you're not going to know the norms of theological interpretation. So this is making reference to the fact that Vatican II's entire interpretation stands on understanding these scholastic theological norms. You have to know all these theological norms in order to understand the council. So if all the bishops disobeyed the St. John the 23rd to have Latin, instead Latin was overturned by all these hotshot theologians who thought they were all awesome after the council, and they started saying whatever they wanted to. So after the council, you have people who say, so for example, there's actually, I think it's a quote in one book I read recently. So there's some hotshot Jesuit whatever theologian said, oh, look, Lumen Gentium says the Roman Catholic Church, or the Church of Christ, subsists in the Roman Catholic Church. This means, says this hotshot Jesuit, that the church no longer believes itself to be the true church. Well, that's because this Jesuit doesn't understand the norms of theological interpretation, that he's actually even fronting that false interpretation. But you have all these experts who are so-called experts, and we know that experts are always right about everything these days. You know, the experts are always telling us what new mask to wear and everything. So so what you had after the council is you had all these experts who were giving public speeches to the faithful, and they were citing these documents, and they were saying, well, this says this, here's what it means because I have a PhD. But they disobeyed John the 23rd. They didn't have Latin. They didn't understand, or maybe they did have Latin, but they just maliciously disobeyed the norms of theological interpretation. But what they were doing was they were completely disobeying Lumen Gentium itself by not interpreting this according to the norms of theological interpretation, because it is absolutely impossible for a council to have enough authority to overturn any established dogma. No ecumenical council can overturn the Immaculate Conception, for example, or like some experts like the Dutch Catechism and whatnot. They were proposing that the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist is now in doubt. Well, that's a dogma of Trent. That's established. Nobody can, that cannot be overturned. You don't even understand the norms of theological interpretation. What was happening was you have all these quote unquote experts who were preaching heresy and citing Vatican II in defense of the heresy. Now, again, we're setting aside all the magisterial questions. So obviously there are certain ambiguities that could be exploited. Okay, fine. But the point is that you have all these heretics who are promoting heresy in different dioceses. Now, so the first two reasons here is they disobeyed the Latin, they lost Latin, they lost the norms of theological interpretation. But the third issue, here's the third issue, is that the crisis in the church arose after the council, just like Lateran V. Lateran V happens, then the Protestant revolt happens. So now we have a new situation. So it's very, very important to understand that Vatican II was called at a point where American Catholicism was on the ascendancy. American Catholicism had just elected John F. Kennedy. Fulton Sheen was the pop star. They were exporting videos or Hollywood movies about Fatima across the world. American Catholicism was in the ascendancy. Western Christian democracy was in the ascendancy. It was the post-war world. Everyone was hopeful that we could rebuild after the destruction of National Socialism. It was an opportune moment to try to play ball with the secular democracies, to try to win them over towards a renewal toward Catholic life. That was actually, it was a debatable idea at the time. At the time. Now, but immediately during and after the council, there's a massive revolt, not only by the heretics, but there's also a sexual revolution that explodes. So now we have a situation that's becoming to be entirely different than the situation that began in 1960 when John F. Kennedy was elected. So what we have is that how can the council, which was called and addressed to modern man circa 1960, not circa 1968 with the sexual revolution. That's not the modern man that the council is addressing. So we have an entirely new situation that arises after the council. So it is it's just illogical to say, well, this council should be able to deal with this new future situation that didn't even exist when the council was in session. So what happens is Ottaviani. So this is the third reason, is that the issues that we are dealing with today arose after the council. We have a worldwide revolt. So how can the council be expected to solve a problem that didn't even exist in the same magnitude during the council? So that's the third reason. The fourth reason is the bishops refused to be bishops. Ottaviani in 1966, as soon as this revolt was breaking out, he said he sent a letter to all bishops of the whole world. They were just in Rome for this council. Ottaviani, head of the Holy Office, sends a letter to everybody and says, if you haven't noticed already, the heretics are running wild in all of your dioceses. Take care of business. And I've linked this letter. This letter is linked below if you want to go read it. So the letter from Ottaviani, and then Archbishop Lefebvre responds and says, yeah, let's take care of business. Let's do it. Everybody needs to condemn these heresies. Let the Holy Father condemn the heresies. The bishops refused to take care of business. So even if Vatican II was an ambiguous, wishy-washy documents or whatever, we can even concede that for a second. But if all the bishops went back to their dioceses and took care of business, they condemned all these heretics. So the big example is the University of Notre Dame in America had right after the council, they had issued this statement that Catholic universities are exempt from church authority. Guess who signed that, by the way? Theodore McCarrick. That's the infamous statement, Land O'Lakes statement. And the Bishop of South Bend wanted to put them under interdict. He was going to clamp down on them. But he instead of taking care of business, he sent a letter to Rome and said, are you going to support me or not? And he apparently didn't really hear much answer or something. So then he decided not to do anything. So then Notre Dame, where like the whole American faithful of the Catholic Church, they viewed Notre Dame as sort of an authority in the Catholic Church, which they should be. They should be a Catholic university. But because Notre Dame was in rebellion against church authority and the bishop refused to do anything, that's what happened. So basically, the bishops refused to take care of business. That's the fourth historical reason. So this is why in the Western Europe and the Americas, Vatican II was a complete failure, because there was this breakdown of theology, and then there's this insane revolution happened after the council, so new situation, and it wouldn't have been that bad if the bishops would have just taken care of business as they were ordered to do by the head of the Holy Office. So this is what the trad movement has been trying to do since at least 1965. Dietrich von Hildebrand had a private meeting with Paul VI and said, you must condemn heresies. You must condemn heresies. And Paul VI said, that's too harsh. That's too harsh. I don't like that. So he didn't condemn any heresies. Ottaviani said to the bishops, you must condemn heresies. Archbishop Lefebvre said, yes, let's condemn heresies. Let the Holy Father condemn heresies. But Paul VI said, no, that's too harsh. So he refused to condemn heresies. 1968 rolls around, and he sort of condemns heresies by means of his Credo of the People of God, 1968. So he puts forth a creed. He condemns contraception, which is great. That was a highlight of his whole pontificate. And since then, John Paul II and Benedict have been basically trying to move towards the condemning of heresies, with more and more clamping down on these heresies with the Universal Catechism, the Oath of Fidelity. Benedict XVI really cracks down even more. So there's been a turn towards this, but this is what the trads have been trying to say since the council, really, but since this whole situation arose. So that is my historical hypothesis as to why it failed in Western Europe and Americas. Jeremiah, what are your thoughts?
Well, I was writing this down because the one thing that stood out is to me was that each of these are people's responses to it. And I don't know enough about, like, for example, how long was there, did the crisis go on after Nicaea, right? How long were the Arians still kicking it? How long were the Jansenists kicking it after Trent? And the influence of them, even with Pascal and others, like how could we say that, the influence of that, that it was a failure of Trent, the kind of way that the church, in fact, and that is a fair point for them in charity toward them to say that they could look at the church and look at their fellow co-religionists and say, look, they've become really worldly. The ascendancy of the Jesuits and some of the predictions they made, even of frequent communion. Like we would say, well, interestingly enough, Pope St. Pius X would normalize that custom of that and kind of make it a staple, in fact, of what we understand now. And now we look at it and say, man, people don't believe in the real presence like they used to. I think there's a lot of factors at play, but either way, that would be one thing that, sometimes even a good counsel, you have a long period of time where it's not playing out the way that you thought. And sometimes the people who get condemned are, in some cases, like with the Jansenists as an example, that they're saying that they're the letter and the spirit of that council. The other one was, it seems like it's not so much and it plays in with the first one, that it's not so much the council itself, but the people. Like the first one, the prelates are not retaining Latin in the liturgy. Experts are not abiding by theological notes. The crisis in the church arose after the council. That's my last contention. And the bishops refused to be bishops. And in all of these cases, that would be distinguishing between the subject and the object. So you might have, let's say, a really good discovery in the realm of medicine, for example. But that may also be around the same time where you have a lot of quacks going around promoting some terrible things. Like there's a lot of good technological discoveries right now that have to, and medical discoveries right now that have to do with helping people live much longer lives that it wasn't around before, even things like pulse radiation. And yet we're surrounded by total quacks, talking about, putting stuff over your face and talking like this, all the time, even when you're playing basketball. The last point is this. That's what our team had to cancel last week because they were told they had to wear masks playing basketball, and God bless Sacred Heart. They're like, nope, we ain't doing it. But the last one is the idea that the crisis in the church arose after the council. I'm always hesitant about this, in part because I think some of the things the council addressed, that they were in fact not just prescient in some ways, but in some ways kind of slow to the ball. Talking about, Marshall McLuhan and his influence, he was already talking about the advances that were coming and the advances that were already taking place in the world of mass communication, for example, and how that would affect the retribalization of man, which that's a fancy phrase for saying that morals are going to shift dramatically. You're going to have like tectonic shifts here with the way that society plays itself out. It's going to be shocking. And he was already talking about that and how it already began, but also that, like the sexual revolution, we had one in 1870, 1953, Playboy culture was prevalent by it wasn't even 1960, and he set himself up shop in Chicago area. 1959, explicit content bans were challenged and overturned. 1963, Putnam's Fanny Hill was put out. And in the 1950s, explicit sex and on-screen and stage was being violated. And so I think that you're seeing like all the conditions are already set. It's already something put into motion that was happening before. And we can find that with the ascendancy of modernism, even during the time of Pius X, and Freemasonry at the time of Leo XIII. That you can go back a ways and say the ideas that led to this, not just technologically, but also theologically, that would lead to what we call the crisis now, that was a long time coming. And so I'm unsure. I'd have to, I must go and look more, but I would say those would be things that I would bring up as things to ponder and to question.
Sir. Yeah. I mean, Pius XII said in 1950, there has been a conspiracy against good morals in film and everything. So yes, it was certainly, I would just say that it wasn't until, I think it was 1964 when the Hollywood code was broken with the pornographic film the pawnbroker. So that was actually the real revolt really blew up in the popular world. I mean, obviously it was happening before, but in terms of widespread student protest, that type of thing was not happening until after the council. But we only have 20 more minutes, and I wanted to include my defense of libertarianism. So Kennedy, what are your thoughts before we get to that?
One of the things that I like to do is I was talking to a priest about my online debate with John Salza. And sometimes for people who vehemently reject the positions of the Society of St. Pius X, it comes down to what this priest said is a lack of the spirit of analogy, which is so common in Roman tradition. It's a very philosophical tool, especially you find this even in Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and so forth. It's the spirit of analogy, Aquinas uses it all the time. Anyway, so I'll use an analogy here to talk about Second Vatican Council. Because there's so much. I will say too, there are some, just before I do that, there are some statements, just a couple here, where, it's really hard to square the circle. And this will prove that I'm not some sort of liberal just because I believe in libertarian methodology, just for everyone. This is from Dignitatis Humanae. It says the Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. And the contrary condemned statement is liberty of conscience and of worship is the proper right of every man. The thing is, you could look at the Vatican Council statement where a human person has a right to religious freedom, and you could use that in a negative sense insofar as, the communists don't have the right to tell you because they're illicit that you can't go to church because there's a cold and flu season. That's a legitimate statement. But to teach it in a positive sense, like this is church teaching that, religious, or at least to present it insofar as it seems that church teaching is that, religious freedom is the stance of Rome. That's the issue, So it's possible to interpret things maybe in a certain sense, but it seems like it's inappropriate for an ecumenical council. I think that's been one of the biggest issues is the sort of confusion of the application of those things, but also the confusion of place. There's things you read in council documents, you go, between people trying to assess like a contextual thing in a certain place, and how do we deal with this because we don't have a Catholic society? So how far do we take tolerance? And I mean, those are things that you could prudentially apply, I think. But when they're taught, at least it seems to the world from the chair of Peter, even though there's notes saying that it's not necessarily binding, technically speaking, in some cases, that has been a big source of confusion. I think that's one of the things. The last thing before I make my analogy is it's almost like the problem with Vatican II, as far as how it's presented, is really what it's lacking, even more so than what it has. And I think that's kind of, it's like the recipe's missing a few ingredients. The parts that are there might be good, but it doesn't make the whole, and then that sort of makes the bad thing. Okay, so the analogy. So I was at a winery a couple years ago, BC, before COVID, in the halcyon days of 2019, I think. And I grew up making wine with my nonno, God rest his soul. So we're there, and the winery was 2 or 3 years old. And I was with a friend, and I said, I wonder where they got the grape plants from, the bushes and the vines and so forth. And he said, I don't know, they must have planted them 2 or 3 years ago. I said, no, they have to be at least 50 years old. You can't make wine with any consistency without it being 50 years old. He's like, what are you talking about? So anyway, we're in this little group with the sommelier. We just went and seen a play, and then we were out there with some friends. And he raises his hand. He goes, when were these plants planted? And she goes, 3 years ago. He looks at me like, haha, gotcha. And she goes, oh, but they were brought over from France because they were about 47, 48 years old when they brought them over. And I was like, told you. And she wanted to explain why you have to use plants that are at least 50 years old to make wine consistently. And there's a reason, and this goes back to Christ when he says, by their fruits you shall know them. And, it talks about pruning the branches and all these sorts of things. And those first 50, and context of why Christ would use certain horticultural analogies is extremely important. You have to understand the plants in the Levant as understood by the people from the Levant to understand why he would use those analogies of those plants in the Levant at that time. And the reason is, the first 50 years or so of a grape harvest, you have a mix of harvests. Some years you have a really good crop of grapes, very sweet, very robust, and you make a great wine. And some years you can only get vinegar. After 50 years, certain plants will not ever produce good. This is like, no bad tree produces good fruit. Certain plants will never produce a good grape, and you have to burn them and put them into the fire. And in fact, if you don't, they actually might corrupt the rest of them because they make viruses or funguses and bacteria. So after 50 years, this is what they do. They say, okay, we can finally use these, and we can continually make a product that is worth drinking. So if you look at the 50 years since the council, there have been some interesting years where it looks like the spirit of Vatican II has been good. There's been John Paul II shows up to World Youth Day, and there's like 2 million kids, and like, that's pretty cool. That seems like a pretty big deal. There's a renaissance of Polish Catholicism, although Poland is not perfect right now, and they're very much struggling with some other stuff there too. They've jumped on a lot of the COVID heresies. But 50 years later, we find, at least in my opinion, and this pertains probably more to the liturgy, although there are outliers, and although it is possible that there are exceptions, generally speaking, it seems like we cannot make any good fruits with these plants anymore. And we are literally just 50 years later with the liturgy, and been 55 years with the council. It doesn't mean that the plants are evil. It doesn't mean that the grapes are evil. It just means that they just can't do the job. And it seems that a council should be called in order to condemn. And this is one thing Jeremiah said, that the Jansenists were still around after the condemnation. Yeah, that's true. I just wish there were condemnations at Vatican II. So we can't really, it's like the modernists are still around. How long will it take? Well, the problem is the modernists weren't condemned at the council. That's kind of the problem. So that's sort of the analogy I'll use. And that's the end for me.
Yeah. So that's the solution that trads, like, as I said, trads have advocated the charitable anathema, as Dietrich von Hildebrand called it, the charitable anathema, as the solution. That's the solution, because the biggest innovation of Vatican II was not the documents, but the decision or the false dichotomy between the medicine of mercy and condemnation, because correcting the sinner is an act of mercy. And so I don't think John the 23rd meant that false dichotomy, but this is what in practice happened, is that bishops believed that if you condemn heresies, you're not being merciful, when in fact you are. That's an act of mercy to all the children whose faith in the real presence has been destroyed by these iconoclast false experts who are destroying the liturgy. But let me get to the libertarianism here. I want to quote from Gaudium et Spes 83, which says this, quote, "It is absolutely necessary for countries to cooperate more advantageously and more closely together, and to organize together international bodies, and to work tirelessly for the creation of organizations which will foster peace." End quote. So obviously this is in the context of the post-war world. This is in the context of the United Nations. This is why Paul VI went to the United Nations and said that we give our moral ratification to this organization, as this might be not the exact quote, but it's very similar, where he says, this is the obligatory path to world peace, the United Nations. And so this is a judgment of the Ecumenical Council and the Pope based on the temporal order and this particular political organization called the United Nations. So this is an example of where we need to go back to the basics of the church. What is the church? The church is the lay and clerical order. And this is, unfortunately, we got to go back to these basics, because we're living in a clerical era where when people say the church, they only mean the clergy. That's not correct. The church is the clergy and the laity, and the laity's job is to sanctify the temporal order, to implement the principles of faith and morals to secure the common good in their particular realm, whether that's a city, state, nation, or whatever. And so it is actually the laity has the final decision. The laity has the final judgment as to the particulars of politics, the particulars of economics, not the principles, because the principles come from faith and morals, these absolute principles, which are given to us by the magisterium. For example, the church cannot be separated from the state, nor the state from the church, defined in that sense. This is church and state. We shouldn't even use those terms anymore. We should say temporal order, or temporal sword and spiritual sword. But those should not be separated. Those are the principles. Now, on a practical, here's where the theological notes come into play, because as Lumen Gentium just said, it has to do with the matter treated. Well, what is the matter treated here in Gaudium et Spes 83? Well, it's international politics. Gaudium et Spes is saying something about international politics. Okay, well, that is the purview of the laity. The laity's job is to implement politics to secure the common good. So if the clergy advise us to say, hey, we think that you should set up this international body, well, we should respect that and say, well, thank you, Your Holiness. We'll take that into consideration. But it is actually our job as laity to make the final decision about the particular implementation. Another great example is the death penalty. St. John Paul II obviously advocated against the death penalty, but that was his opinion about the moral situation of the common good at the time. But the CDF actually explicitly confirmed that you can just disagree with the Holy Father about the death penalty. You can also disagree about the Holy Father about this particular war is a just war or not, because it is the laity's job to secure the common good and to make the final decision about the particulars of securing that common good. So I'm trying to make the proper distinctions here, but this is the area where the libertarians, because what I'm saying is that some libertarians, not Kennedy, but some libertarians just shoot from the hip with their theology. They say things like, oh, well, that's not infallible, so I can just throw that out. Well, there's so many things wrong with that statement. First of all, you don't know your theological distinctions here. Second, you're not being pious. You have to piously accept everything the bishops say, period. Meaning you accept it with piety. You accept it as a son of the church. You listen to it, but for certain things, you do have the authority to completely disagree respectfully. I'm going to respectfully disagree, Your Holiness, because we are going to impose the death penalty in this case because it will secure the common good. And that's my job as the ruler of this nation. I have to secure the common good. So this is another great example is Franco. So Franco, after the Second Vatican Council, the sources indicate that Paul VI tried to pressure Franco to give more freedom to the Protestants in Spain, and then also to allow him to give a lot more free reign to a lot more mercy to the Marxists, shall we say. And Franco was against it because he knew what Marxists were like. And but what happened was after Franco's death, they did give more mercy to the Marxists. The Marxists took over Spain. Now Spain is what it is today. So this is the area I think where the libertarians can totally disagree if we're talking about the particulars of securing the common good. But libertarians cannot disagree when we're talking about the fundamental principles of Catholic social teaching, i.e. Christ is king, and the separation of church and state cannot be forwarded. And so this is what I understand, Kennedy, what you're basically forwarding a form of libertarian method, which does not accept liberal principles. It's totally against liberal principles, but uses certain libertarian methods. So Kennedy, what do you think about that? And we'll have Jeremiah end with his comments.
That's a pretty good assessment, I guess. One thing too, because I listened to not the whole show you guys did last week, but just some of it. And one of the comments that when you guys were talking about could there be an application of libertarianism that was useful for Catholicism was, I think the term that you guys used was could it be a stopgap against the Marxists, so to speak. I'm actually going to go one further than that, and I'm going to try to, again, use an analogy here. Throughout history, we see certain genies come out of the bottle. We have the genie of Gnosticism. It just never goes away. I mean, it can be suppressed, but it never goes away. You can't put it back in. It just reinvents itself and under different names. You have the genie of Mohammedanism. It comes out of the desert, can't put it back in. It's just there, obviously, through conversion and through certain things. You have the genie of Marxism. It's out of the bottle. You're never going to put it back in. Obviously, again, you could suppress, convert, whatever, but it's there. It's out. It's like a new virus, to use the, and it's never going away. Okay. So once that happens, you have to put in mechanisms in place because you can't pretend that it can't rear its ugly head again. I believe that, and this is where I agree with the libertarians on their some of their historical critiques are silly, but and again, there's many different ones, but one of the things that is a consensus is they start to get real uppity about the political order, starting with the Protestant heresies of the divine right of kings and so forth, because that perverts what monarchy is. So you've had these genies come out of the bottle, and another analogy is, you've got these cities that are surrounded by water and they build dams. You could call a dam a stopgap, but it's as permanent as anything, because it's like maybe this sea might recede one day. Could happen. We never know, but you can't pretend that it will, and you can't know that it will. So you have a dam that it's not eternal; it'll go away one day, but it is permanent. As far as anything's permanent, I believe that what we've seen in the modern era in Catholic countries is that there were no mechanisms that were sufficient in place to defend against Marxism. And what I mean by that was, and this is why I disagree with the integralists in application, even though I understand the principles. The traditional Catholic political order, when it is not applied in a state where the people themselves are converted, I think inevitably leads to a statism and a totalitarianism, because it's on the razor's edge of that. And that's what we've seen in every single Catholic country. We are now living under totalitarianism in every single formerly Catholic country on earth, basically. Even Poland is struggling with this right now. You have people who are in positions of power who, when they're really nice guys, things go well. But as soon as the really nice guy thing is taken out, all of a sudden they say, well, it's for the common good. Shut up and put a diaper on your face. And there's no mechanism to stop them doing that, because it wasn't fathomed before. It was like, well, who would ever do that? Because we're Catholic. We would never do something like that. Okay. So I believe the genie of Marxism has been let out of the bottle. The genie of statism has been let out of the bottle, and it'll never go back in until Christ decides to do so. Triumph of the Immaculate Heart, whatever. I don't know. I'd love one of these miracles to happen. It just hasn't. So I believe that, and this is why I'm going to finish my article today to hand it into my editor on time here, Tim, I promise. Even if we were to have a Catholic monarchy or something again, I still believe that there is, because of original sin and because of the genies that have been out of the bottle, that we have to implement severe limits to what is ever possible for a government in this technologically advanced modern age, where the president of the United States can do more with a phone call than Henry VIII can do with his entire army. He can do more with a TikTok video than Hitler could do, for goodness sake. I think that we have to have these, and if we don't, we're stupid, because we've seen what's happened, and it will happen again in some places, assuming we get rid of the nonsense, because people will fall, they will sin, heresies will rear their ugly head, because that's what history tells us. And if we don't have these severe limits in place, then they won't be just trying to jab untested and experimental substance in your kid's arm. It will be a lot worse than that, and we're idiots if we think otherwise. So I don't think libertarianism is a stopgap any more than I think that putting a dam up to stop the sea from taking over the Netherlands is a stopgap. That's the environment we live in now, and we have to have a mechanism in place. That's what I believe.
All right. Good points, Kennedy. I like what you're saying. I pretty much agree, but with qualifications. But let's Jeremiah, you'll get the last laugh here. Jeremiah, if you want to give the final word, Jeremiah, and then we'll close out. Go ahead.
No laughing. I think that the genie's also been let out of the bottle on relativism, individualism, this kind of libertinism. And so it's one of those things that if we were to do it the opposite direction, because he's right, there's twin rocks of shipwreck. So he's right to point out one of the rocks being collectivism. But I say that individualism, as warned by the popes, has the same kind of thing, because those genies have been let out of the bottle too. And we see what happens in societies when it gets really loosey-goosey. We know what happens even in small sectors, big sectors, religious sectors, political sectors. What happens when people are kind of let loose in that way, which is why I wouldn't say that it's a stopgap. I would have said it was termite tactics. That the idea of using the things at our disposal in order to chip away at what we think is problematic, not necessarily to set up a brand new, dam. And he's right. Sometimes those things are permanent. Sometimes you can literally blow them up with dynamite. Sometimes you can just simply take it out. You can say, look, I put something in a plug to stop it, and all of a sudden you take it out, and now the energy is flowing as it was before. And so there's things that you can do that would be called termite tactics. I've mentioned that before in a book on Christian resistance, edited by Gary North. It's from the early 80s, and I think it's got some good ideas on things we can even do right now. However, last thing is that when talking about, what are we going to do in a situation where you have a king that's, or a president or anybody where all of a sudden it's really bad, what do you do with that? That has been the case from the beginning. I mean, and we have examples of it. It was never a time where it was just like, well, we're Catholic, we don't do that. I don't believe that. Not in in Europe, and not even in Israel. I think we can go in the Bible and we can say, look, this is a system, right? This idea of a kingship, an idea of a kingdom, with rulers that are able to guide men's lives. That structure, just like the church structure, and just as a purely organizational construct, to say there are times where it's led by really bad folks. But the idea of saying we need to put hardcore restrictions on it. Now, people can say, well, that's a divine thing. And you say, well, God also says he's the one that put those people in power, even the people who are wicked bad. And oftentimes the people who are wicked bad are there because we've been wicked bad. And the idea is that we need to repent. And that's the main gist. Anytime you see a wicked king, anytime you see somebody come in, it's not, hey, we need to get rid of kingdoms. It's not anything like that. We need to, have no government. It's, you need to literally have sackcloth and ashes on, because this is punishment. And I think that it's the further we get away from that idea, the further we get away from the idea that God, in fact, judges nations. And we just get into this hyper individualistic notion that he just judges individuals. And I think that that's a risk of going in the direction that Kennedy's talking about. But at the same time, I think he's provided throughout this entire conversation that goes back, it's been going on for a while, that he's provided a lot of things that are worthy to think about. And that especially in places and times. And look, everybody here, last thing, everybody here knows where I stand on the society, right? I'm not a fan, right? I'm very critical of it, things like that. However, through conversations with people who live in Canada, where Kennedy is, that people who live there and say, I can't even go to mass because I don't have the passport, like those kind of conversations with people that I disagree with, generally speaking, and we can get in these big debates and stuff. I've appreciated learning from them and learning from them and coming to a place that's more empathy for their particular situation. Doesn't change my normative stance on it, but it does change sometimes a particular one or a situational one. And it's the same thing with the termite thing, to say, look, sometimes this is the way it's got to go. But I'm grateful. I'm only using that as an example to say that it's similar, that this is something that I've had to think about, because it's easy to get wrapped up in an ideal and to say, well, this is the normative position, therefore always and at all times. And sometimes that might not be the case. And I'm glad to have had his insights to be able to at least kind of toss them around in my head and in my heart to think it through, to better my position as well.
Yes. Thank you, Kennedy. I think you, as I said, you've provided the best case for libertarian that I've ever seen. So we're gonna have one more show of libertarianism. So we had to have the Byzantine Scotist on next week because he wanted to provide his thoughts, and then we're gonna have Kennedy Hall's going to choose 10 shows of his own making, where we're gonna promote his book every week for 10 weeks, because he's been such a good sport debating both of us who both disagree with him. So yeah, Kennedy, you get 15 shows in a row from now on.
Let's just make it 20. Let's make it an even 20, man.
Okay, we're gonna go through the 20 chapters of.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, a chapter. Yeah, every week we'll do a new chapter of Terror of Demons. That's what we do.
Wow.
Actually, seriously, we should do something with Catholic masculinity for Lent.
Sure,
especially.
why not?
But
Yeah.
anyways, Kennedy gets to decide. Later today we'll have 3 p.m. Edmund Mazza. We're going to be talking more about the theological notes. So this is an important topic to hash out, discuss. Again, there are links below with further information on theological notes and some of the sources we talked about. Once again, please become a patron of Paleocrat Diaries. That's linked below. And being a Catholic, you can join the guild. You can join the Wolf Pack chat. And once again, please buy 87 copies of Terror of Demons.
And pray for me to write the book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Prayers for Jeremiah. So we also have the March for Life this week. So let's pray for all the pilgrims who are going to Washington, D.C.
Including my son. It's his first time, man. Well, he's been to D.C. before. Oh, no, he wasn't. He didn't go to D.C. with us. This will be his first time in D.C. And he's super pumped. He's going with the church and the school. And so he's really excited about that.
Last thing, global warming is a lie. I just checked the forecast. It's like minus 20 Celsius, and they're predicting 20 to 40 centimeters of snow. Greta lies, and because of that, economies die. So there you go.
There you go.
Excellent. Yes. Loving the snow right now. I just went sledding with my boys yesterday. It was great.
Yeah.
All right. Let's offer up on our Father, ultimately for Christ the King to reign in our hearts, in our souls, in our societies. In whatever way we need to fight against the Marxists, may we do so with the power of the cross in our location, in our local community. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Pater noster qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra.
Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitti nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen.
Nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Jesus is King.